How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Zekko Football Channel. In one of the results of the weekend, Newcastle United ripped apart Aston Villa and beat them by 5-1. Today we're diving into how Newcastle claimed such a victory and what they did so well to exploit Aston Villa's frailties. If you are new to the channel, please make sure that you subscribe, you like the video and turn on those notifications so that we may see each other for another time. But now let's discuss how Newcastle ripped apart Aston Villa. Probably one of the craziest games of the weekend tactically. Newcastle, Aston Villa. Newcastle 5, Aston Villa 1. Now, really, Aston Villa imploded in the second half, but they did quite a few good things. I liked the way that they played through Newcastle on certain occasions. I liked the pace of Diaby. I liked the wing play from McGinn and Bailey. Even though Bailey didn't necessarily win his duels all too often, Ollie Watkins drifted into certain areas which allowed Aston Villa to then progress up the pitch. They failed to get the ball to him towards the latter stages of the second half, and that was one of the things that really curtailed Aston Villa's progress. The midfield pairing of Douglas Luiz and Boubacar Kamara I thought was something that lacked a little bit. Defensively they just weren't there, whereas they are good at progressing the ball through the thirds. I didn't think that they really had the steel or the determination to stop Newcastle going forwards. Unai Emery's tactics are to get the fullbacks up as high and wide as possible to keep the width on the pitch and just generally within his attacking side. This allows Bailey and McGinn to then come into the centre of the pitch. It makes sure that they're able to overload certain areas and then get players into the box more often than not. The progression of the ball is extremely key, and making sure that you get correct players in the correct opportunities, I think, is where Unai Emery wants to get his side playing, getting the likes of Ollie Watkins further and closer into the middle of the goal, making sure Diaby can burst through with his pace, and that can only be afforded by making sure that they can have overloads in certain areas. Newcastle tried to combat this by playing a three-man midfield of Joe Linton, Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes. There was a lot made of where Tonali was going to play, and it turned out that he was in this right-hand role, almost the Joe Willock role, if you will, from last season. He moved in with Bruno Guimaraes at certain occasions to make sure that they kept the ball and allowed it to keep recycling and progressing through the lines. But it's into the second half that I really want to get a focus on, and really what ended up happening was that when Villa started to progress the ball forwards, they weren't clinical enough with their passing. They weren't able to find Ollie Watkins anymore. They weren't able to find Diaby because they had progressed too far up the pitch. They needed a player in the middle of the park to be able to progress the ball, to allow that transition, something of a Coutinho or even perhaps Jacob Ramsey, to be able to take the ball from one of the left-hand sides or even through into the middle of the pitch and drive forwards, taking some Newcastle players with him and then offloading the ball into a different area. Douglas Luiz is not this player, and neither is Kamara. I didn't think that Kamara had enough about him to really drive through. A good example of this is Yves Bissouma when he played for Tottenham against Brentford. If you haven't seen that game, I implore you, after you've watched this, please stay here. After you've watched this, go and check out those highlights, because Yves Bissouma did a fantastic job of driving through the thirds. Another way of doing it is progressing the ball with passing. This can be done very similar to the way that Enzo Fernandez did it against Liverpool. Two prime examples of how to progress the ball as a midfielder. Now, I thought Kamara was fine, and I thought tactically he was okay, even though he didn't have the steel that I would have liked to help out Douglas Luiz in making sure they created a wall in front of their back four. But progressing the ball wise, I didn't think he was anywhere near good enough. He did not really make it through those thirds, and it's one of the major things that stopped Aston Villa from really progressing. Newcastle got their second goal, and it seemed like Villa got a little bit desperate, and it was in the second half that you really started to see that. When Unai Emery wants to defend, he likes to play a high line. He likes his back two to really press up towards the halfway line. Now, the major thing around doing this is because it condenses the space. It allows Aston Villa to be able to create turnovers from the pressure by having so many players in the same area. It also means that Newcastle shouldn't be able to progress the ball through their midfield. There is a problem with this though. If you are not switched on well enough and you do not block out the space in correct scenarios, you can be bypassed. And in this Aston Villa system with the two fullbacks going forwards, Digne and Matty Cash, I thought they did a very poor job of making sure that they knew where the line was. And if we transition over, I should say, to this slide, this is what I'm talking about. This is Aston Villa, or more importantly, this is Aston Villa's average positions. Now we have Diaby and we have Watkins up in these central striking roles. Diaby joined Watkins more often than not to try and create that almost dovetailed approach. You have Bailey out on this right hand side and McGinn out on this left. Now the position of Digne is extremely important because, as I said, Unai Emery wants to make sure that the lines are created through overloads. The lines for passing are created through overloads, and that is one of the reasons why Digne is so high up. It also means that they want to create pressing actions to be able to create turnovers higher up Newcastle's pitch. The problem with this is that it leaves these two players in Kamara and Douglas Luiz extremely isolated. And if it leaves the two midfielders extremely isolated, it definitely leaves the two centre-backs in absolute no man's land. The line I've drawn here, the green line here, is the defensive line that Aston Villa held when they were playing in the second half. Extremely high. Very, very high. Now, this player is Pau Torres. This player is the likes of Konsa. Konsa and Pau Torres are not the fastest players, and it's already dangerous enough to play a high line with that. But when you lose your pacey players in terms of Matty Cash and Digne, it means that these two, in the two centre-backs, are extremely isolated. The midfield line was far too far away from the defensive line, and the striking line, or the attacking line, was too far away from the midfield. There was too much space in between this Aston Villa setup, and when they tried to play the ball through, it was cut out by channels created from Tonali, Joe Linton, and Bruno Guimaraes. Gordon and Almiron dropped back in as well to create a congested midfield, and that meant that Newcastle were able to counter. It's the counter that I think is the extremely important part of this. Because of the lines that were dropped off from the likes of Matty Cash and Digne, it left Konsa and Pau Torres extremely isolated. Lines were able to be pressed, lines were able to be broken, and it meant that Aston Villa were left with counter-attacking or counter-pressing scenarios more often than not. A lot of the time you'd see the likes of Konsa and Pau Torres running towards their own goal, something that they absolutely do not want to do. A good scenario of this is right here. Now here it looks a little bit complicated, but don't worry. What you're seeing here is essentially the Newcastle midfield three blocking out certain space and passing lanes. This stops the likes of Diaby getting the ball, the likes of Watkins getting the ball. It also stops the likes of the two wingers getting the ball. And then that means that this entire attacking line is broken. Newcastle can then break out from that, and this scenario happened more often than not. You've got Gordon here and you've got Almiron here. Isak breaks the lines as well. It generally turned to a 3-on-3 or a 3-on-2 in certain occasions, and I'm not kidding when I say that Aston Villa could have shipped 6 or 7 in this match. It was that bad, and Unai Emery's resistance to change anything, or at least to try and close the gaps, to try and close the passing lanes, nothing happened. None of it happened, and it eventually meant that Newcastle kept getting in time after time again. This is how Newcastle exploited the way that Aston Villa wanted to go forwards, the way they were tactically set up, which was just brilliantly thought about by Eddie Howe. But I was really disappointed by the way that Unai Emery set up his team, essentially committing something of footballing suicide, leaving Konsa and Pau Torres high and dry. Now, the communication between these two, I say in my general review called The Recap. If you haven't seen it, please go and check it out after this. But really, I said that the communication just wasn't there, because at certain times what you'd see is Pau Torres would drop a little bit further and Konsa would go in and start pressing. Now, that should not happen. You need to do one or the other, and you need to communicate with your fellow centre-back to make sure that you know what you're doing. This area highlighted here is essentially no man's land for the Aston Villa centre-backs, but it's absolutely prime hunting ground for the likes of Anthony Gordon, for Almiron, and for Alexander Isak, who obviously got his 2 goals. It was a masterclass in real counter-attacking opportunity or countering the way that the opposition play. And I thought that this was created by the two centre-backs being completely isolated and the two midfielders not being up to the task to be able to drop that little bit deeper to stop those Newcastle United passing lanes. Newcastle completely outdid Aston Villa in this scenario, and it will be very interesting to see how Unai Emery responds in their next game, because something needs to change. Thank you ever so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.